Team. All right, proud, fine, quickest, nice, brilliant.
No.
Creamy, convenient, fresh, natural, rich, hefty, faster, soothing, dependable, instant, amazing, push button, plastic, automatic,
Brighter,
clean, flashing, no good.
Good night, ladies and gentlemen.
Good night.
Good night, Jet. Good night, David.
Yes, 1965 was a pivotal year, filled with social and political upheaval. This morning, we've invited a panel of guests who were very active during those years as we passed from the conservative 50s into the turbulence of the 60s, the civil rights movement, and a war we didn't want.
Not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need. Not as a call to battle, though in battle we are. But a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about. The Marines have burned this old couple's cottage because fire was coming from here. Now when you walk into the village, you see no young people at all.
Southeast Asia to help our friends pursue their own opportunity to be free of imported terror, of alien assassination managed by the North Vietnam communists based in Hanoi and backed by the Chinese communists from Peking.
We shall neither act as aggressors nor tolerate acts of aggression. We intend to bury no one. And we do not intend to be buried.
Think back, October 1965. 100,000 students in Madison, Wisconsin, marching and sleeping in protest to the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, down south, avenues of protest unwind on behalf of the civil rights movement. A dream deferred finally catches the ears and the hearts of America. December, Gemini 6 and 7 are up in space. A trip to the moon, no longer a faraway goal, but a soaring reality. As we said before, this morning we've invited a group of people who were very active in the 60s to talk about the politics of the 60s. First of all, Dick Goodwin in 1965. He was writing speeches for America's President, Lyndon Johnson. Dorothy Cotton. In 65, Dorothy was a top assistant to Martin Luther King. Arlo Guthrie, graduating from high school in 65. Arlo was dodging the draft as an adamant anti-war protester. Howard Zinn. In the spring of 65, he led Boston's first anti-Vietnam rally. Avi Nelson. In 65, he was attending Cornell, first opposing the war in Vietnam, which he later supported. Gentlemen, and Dorothy, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Dick, you were a spokesman for the administration. You were working for Lyndon Johnson, preparing speeches and one thing or another. What was the basic reason? We're going back 17 years now, and many have forgotten it, if they ever knew. What was the basic reason for our being there?
In Vietnam, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you meant Washington for a minute.
No, I didn't. Your job.
I left the government at the end of 65, but of course we were at the beginning of that year. I assume we were in Vietnam, at a military presence there as we had in about 20 countries around the world as part of what we then regarded as a worldwide struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for influence and domination in the Third World. It was only during that year that the escalations, the bombing in January and the combat troops in April, transformed our participation or assistance in a Vietnamese struggle into an American war, and fundamentally, I think, changed the character. Then became my own judgment, the irrational pursuit of what might have been a rational policy to start with, and disaster.
Didn't we hear the words early on, though, that our presence and the commitment was that we were preserving democracy in Southeast Asia?
Well, I think we were preserving the interests of the United States in Southeast Asia, as we had earlier in Guatemala, as we were with our troops in Korea, as we were then in Peru, as we were in parts of Africa, all the places where we had American military presence.
Well, Howard, you didn't buy that approach. You didn't buy the arguments. You called it a theater of the absurd.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it was absurd because we were talking about democracy and we were supporting a dictatorship, and we were talking about doing it for America, and in fact, we were doing it for, I think, a very small number of political and economic interests in the United States who found this important to them. But even before the point that Dick talked about, even before the escalation of the war, the United States was on the side of real colonialism. We supported the French when the French were trying to defeat the Indo-Chinese when they had their independence movement. So I saw it from the beginning, from the very beginning of American involvement, which was really in the 40s and 50s. It was the old imperial drive of the big Western powers to control nations in Africa, Asia, Latin America.
Did you ever think of the irony that you and Douglas MacArthur were on the same side?
Are you thinking about...
He said militarily, no, never have commitments there.
Yeah, well, from his point of view, he's probably wise. He probably foresaw the fact, which a lot of Americans didn't see, that military, and which a lot of Americans still don't see, that arms do not necessarily bring victory, and that strength does not necessarily lie in how many guns you have. It depends on, lots more important things.
Well, there's a bit of irony, too, in the fact that this is Remember Vietnam Week. Arlo, I said before that you dodged the draft.
I didn't really dodge it so much. I confronted it. A lot of people took off.
And went the other way.
A lot of people took off and didn't want to deal with it. And I mean, some went into the Army and didn't want to deal with it, and some went to Canada. But I refused to do either one because I felt that for somebody my age, we were still thinking about how close we were to our parents and stuff like that. And it seemed to me that we were about to inherit not just a war, but a world that wasn't the kind of world we thought was going to be. And we didn't like it.
Yet your father, Woody, wrote, "This land is your land. Made
That's
for
right.
you and me."
Yep. And I think that that's the exact kind of attitude that I had also. And that seeing as how I couldn't drink at that time, I sure didn't want to go fight anybody, at least having a good night to think about it. I thought that, I remember that 65 is when we all got out of high school. And it was that class of people who the next year started causing problems in the universities. And it was a great time. I had a wonderful time in 65.
You had a great time.
I did. Well, we need more times like that, and I think Reagan's going to help.
All right. Dorothy, Vietnam, like other wars, again, was called a poor man's war. And a lot of the blacks of the South, black young men, went to Vietnam to fight that battle. What was their feeling in the South?
Well, I'm sure they went to fight that battle as they went to fight many other battles. We're talking about a group of folk that had been, as far as I'm concerned, lulled to sleep. That is, programmed into feeling that the patriotic thing to do was to bear arms, to defend one's country. But that particular war, especially, probably more than any other, caused a real awakening among black people, as many other groups of racial groups. People began to realize that there was something in this particular experience that helped us learn that our country had great capacity for violence, and that it really just made no sense to decide that this was the way to solve all of our problems. Though many of them black young men went into the war, they did start to learn through the leadership of folk like Martin Luther King and many other folk who came to speak out against the war, and who came into a new awareness of the abominable violence of which we were capable, and especially against innocent people who did nothing to us. They I think, started to wake up and learn some things, even though they were, some of them, already in uniform.
We want to talk about the effect of the civil rights movement. We'll do that later. But right now, Avi, you said at the beginning that you were against the Vietnam involvement. But was it the demonstrations that turned you around?
Yeah, it really was. I was one of the earlier ones before it became popular to oppose the war, because I began to wonder exactly what we were doing there and whether we were accomplishing what we were saying we were supposed to accomplish. But what caused repulsion in me was when I saw the anti-war movement become very extreme, closing down campuses. I was a graduate student at the time. I couldn't get to class. And some of the rhetoric became extreme. And I know Arlo made an interesting point, and that is that he had a lot of fun during the 60s. And bring back the good old days. There were elements there where people enjoyed being iconoclastic, shattering the establishment for its own sake. And at that point, I began to wonder whether the side I was with hadn't taken on such a different complexion that it had other ramifications. And so I found myself gradually being pushed in the other direction.
Howard, there was violence in the demonstrations. That affected many people. I don't know if it was Avi, but what precipitated that? It was not Gandhian.
No, I think you're wrong about that.
How many
think
times?
the anti-war demonstrations
was it the 6 o'clock news?
among the most, I was the 6 o'clock news. The violence was created by the police and the National Guard. I was in an awful lot of demonstrations in the 60s. It was remarkable how nonviolent the anti-war movement was. Absolutely remarkable. It's like accusing the black movement of being violent because people marched across the bridge and then they were attacked by National Guard. Then you had scenes of violence. And that's what the anti-war violence was about. Oh, sure, there may have been a few individuals here and there, very, very tiny proportion, who might have thrown rocks at police in anger or done something like that. Or maybe they were agents from the FBI or CIA. They were more likely to commit violence than the people, who were in the anti-war movement. No, it was a remarkably nonviolent movement, remarkably restrained.
Well, it was mentioned at that time, Dick, in the White House with Lyndon Johnson, did a siege mentality develop?
Well, I think only towards the end of the year. Vietnam, that 65 was really the year of transition. After all, it was in March of 65 that we had the Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress. And Martin Luther King sent a telegram to Lyndon Johnson saying that how a remarkable twist of history it would be that a white Southern president should be the final emancipator of the black race. I got that telegram. But I think as the year developed and as Vietnam became more and more at the forefront, especially after the combat troops went in the spring, everything else became paralyzed. And the flood of sort of liberal legislation, Johnson's desire to out Roosevelt, all dried up as the entire energies of the government became focused on this one unwinnable issue. And then I think the mentality of that sort did develop.
There was such a dovetailing or mix, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. This speech in Washington perhaps was the bell cry, and it is now famous. Let's remember those words of Martin Luther King right now.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Dorothy, in 1965, at what stage was the civil rights movement?
At what stage was it? Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, at what stage.
The beginning, the middle?
Maybe we could consider it in the middle of that particular phase of the civil rights movement.
Howard, you taught in the South at a black university, right?
Yeah, Spelman College, yeah.
Spelman College. Tell us your feelings then. What were the feelings around you? A white man teaching there?
Well, it was a marvelous thing to behold, to see the awakening of my students in the early 60s, starting with the sit-ins, of students who, like students everywhere, only maybe black students more than white students, and women, since my students were women more than men, being trained to obey authority and trained to toe the line. And then suddenly, when they become awakened by things that had happened, by what had happened in 55 in Montgomery, and then, of course, the first sit-ins in 60. And then you saw these students who were so careful and so polite and so obedient to authority suddenly burst out of these bounds and go downtown, march, sit in, get arrested, go to jail, and learn to defy authority. This, to me, was the great lesson of the 60s. People learned that those people who are in power, the presidents, whether they're of universities or of the country or of corporations, are people who don't necessarily know what they're doing and certainly don't necessarily care about everybody else.
Arlo, you're involved.
Well, you know,
Was there a period
what
at
he's
this
saying
time?
is exactly what I felt. I suddenly felt, you know, when I was listening to Martin Luther King's speech again, that I am the age of the children he was talking about. And it began all of a sudden when we realized that there were more important things than race. There were more important things in economic status, because these things were life-threatening. They're going through the Cuban missiles and all that stuff, and going through thinking about nuclear destruction. All of a sudden, we realized as young kids that this was it. We were either going to have to do something about the world or forget it. And I suddenly realized with all my friends all at the same time that it was going to be up to us, because these people who were running things didn't know what they were doing.
But look at how it's turned out, John. The people who tried to make the changes, how well have the changes worked out? I mean, we've used 17 years
Well, we're still
later.
working on it, though.
Well, limited
I mean,
success.
nothing's going to change overnight. But, you know, there are postmen who couldn't work in '65 because they wore beards. There were people who couldn't go to school because they had blue jeans. Now, those things may be just silly, but they are significant of the changes that we've made.
Along with the unrest generated by the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, there was a definite change in our values. The sexual revolution started. College students began using the pot and the pill. There was talk about legalizing abortion. Priests and ministers were marching for peace. The American dream was changing. Joining me now to continue our discussion, Alice Brock, who was running a restaurant in 1965 called Alice's Restaurant out in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Good morning, Alice.
Good morning.
Dan Wakefield was writing his first novel and teaching at UMass Boston. Welcome, Dan.
Thank
you. And again, Howard Zinn, who led the first anti-war demonstration here in Boston, and Dick Goodwin was writing speeches for President Johnson. Now, we've been talking about the politics of Vietnam and the civil rights movement. We can overlap anytime you want to bring up any thoughts on that, but let's talk about those values, the changing. Howard, how about you? Hindsight is an advantage, but it's still not easy to put in place, is it?
Well, what I guess what impresses me most is what I began to talk about before our big break, and that is that people were learning to think for themselves and to act for themselves, and to become less dependent on other people's notions of what was right and wrong. And this extended beyond politics to just ways of life and sexual relations and music and everything else. And it seems to me this was the most important and positive thing about changes in attitudes. Yes, people beginning to realize that all of us are capable of thinking for ourselves. We don't have to accept the word from on high.
Well, Dan, what about the family structure, though?
Well, I think one of the positive things that was that people, you know, when I grew up in the 50s, it was like there was just one way that everybody could do things. And then the family structure, you had to get married, you had to settle down, you had to live in a house and do that. And a lot of people weren't good at that, and it caused a lot of unhappiness. And I think that the 60s didn't say that was bad. It said, okay, there's other ways too. And I think that was a good thing that's still with us, that people see there are other ways of life, there are other ways, other kinds of sexual or mating habits, and that people can be real human beings and follow other ways that seem to be best suited for them.
Alice, how about you as a woman? What were your feelings?
It wasn't a sexual revolution for women in the 60s.
Was it for the men?
Yeah.
Oh,
but I don't think it was at all for the women. I mean, we were told that there was all this great freedom, but when were abortions legalized? In the 70s. So you can't even think about
but didn't the
freedom
impetus
for
come
women.
from the 60s?
Yes, it did, but I don't feel that the women I knew, we didn't know what the hell was going on, except that our boyfriends and husbands could sleep around, and there was a lot of fooling around.
Yeah.
But our situation was still the good little wife or the piece of property, or wasn't so great for women.
Dick, let me ask you this. Do you think historians down the road will look back at the 60s and these years as being the start of America's moral decay?
I think they may view it as the start of America's decay. I think it depends a lot on our the actions of the next generation, but not moral decay. I think the decay, the moral decay, came from within the government, from within the power structure, and not had nothing to do with the sexual revolution.
Not an extension of
I think those
society,
things.
huh?
Of course, I was in Washington. You know, good things always get to Washington last, so I didn't.
But let me ask you
couldn't
this,
get to New
Dick.
York. But you look back now, and you see that the same corporations and the oil companies, or the conservative forces that were moving towards power then, are more powerful than ever before, and none of that has changed. They haven't been affected by this.
You talk about, I use the word moral decay because you've heard the expression. That decay in Washington, critics have said, has been there all the time. That wasn't generated in the 60s. It was just found out.
No, I don't know. We never had a president driven from office before. As there was one elected, I remember in 1968 over my protest. I think that we've never been in a situation as we are now, say in Central America, where nobody on either side believes the government of the United States when it speaks. I think that there's been a very fundamental decline and I don't mean it's a psychic decline, but a decline in the quality of government and in the rule way in which economic interests, large, powerful economic interests, dominate this country to the exclusion of the interests and well-being of the rest of the people. That's a moral decline.
Well, so then, Howard, things haven't changed that much since the 60s, if what Dick says is true?
Oh, I think he's right about that. And I think you were right. I think everybody's right. You see, I think
you're in an awful good mood today, Howard. All right.
Well, at least both people.
What did I say?
That we always had that moral decay in the government. You know, after all, we went into the Philippines at the turn of the century, like we went to Vietnam in the 50s and 60s and so on. But I agree that the same situation. What we're seeing now in Central America. Is as vicious and immoral as what we were doing in Vietnam, and Reaganism is a kind of extension of everything bad that happened in the 60s and what the government was doing and the profiteering of the corporations and so on. So, and that's I agree with Dick. The moral decay is there and has been there in Washington. So that those people who say the 60s were an era of moral decay, well, if they're talking about the power structure, yes, but I think it was a moral resurgence, I think, for people.
Dan?
Yeah, I was going to say that it seems to me the whole point of it was that there could be a moral decay in Washington, but for the first time, people, citizens, including students, could say, no, I don't accept this way. I'm going to do something about this. And that was the big turnaround. And the whole civil rights movement was that, of people saying, I don't accept what I believe to be morally wrong. And this was a whole new way.
But we had this picture of the liberated woman, too. And Alice says, that's not true.
I'm not going to argue with Alice, I'll tell you about that. But Alice told me how to make better chili once, and that's what I'm going to do. No, but I still think, though, that the having got to freedom to have abortions in the 70s was because of the changes and painful things that went about in the 60s. So I don't think it was all nirvana or great, but at least there was a different way of looking at things that could lead to some better situations.
Oh, yeah, I think things opened up a lot. I'm a woman, but I'm also a human being, and I certainly was affected by and excited by what was going on and the idea that you could create your own way.
Well, in another segment, we're going to talk about the media and entertainment, and I can hardly wait to get your reaction, Alice, because Hollywood discovered you, and that was an experience that you've never forgotten.
Yes.
When Hollywood came to Sturbridge.
Stockbridge.
Stockbridge.
Yes.
Maybe they should have gone to Sturbridge.
I wish they had.
All right, we'll talk about that later. But also the changes in the church. They were considerable, too.
Well, for me, as a Christian who didn't think much of a church, two big things happened to me. One, I was teaching in the South, and I saw the black church, and it's the role that it played in the civil rights movement, and the singing, and the spirit, and the excitement. What a marvelous thing it was. And then in the anti-war movement, I suddenly got to know Daniel Berrigan and Philip Berrigan and Liz McAllister and all these priests and nuns. I always thought priests and nuns were very strange people. you know, and suddenly here they were.
You met the Jesuits.
That's right, the Jesuits and the Josephites. I even began to know the difference between the two.
But wasn't that black church always traditionally the backbone of the black community?
It was the backbone of the black community, but it had rarely played such a positive role. Yeah.